Good. So thanks very much, everyone, for joining us today. Last Wednesday and Thursday was Young Carers Action Day. It was actually last Wednesday, but Scotland did something on Thursday as well because Carers Trust Scotland managed to secure a debate in Scottish Parliament. We were really privileged to take some young people from Forces families along to that. They were absolutely delighted. Particularly, they got to shake John Swinney's hand, and Nicola Sturgeon came at the end and posed for photographs with them. So they were delighted to be part of that. But we wanted to take the opportunity to have a slightly more informal form of CLD than we've been doing to date, and kind of doing an in conversations with. You guys, I will confess, are our guinea pigs to this first way of doing some of this, and we'd really like your feedback at the end to see how this goes as a learning opportunity for everyone. But before I go into any more detail, I will get everyone to introduce themselves. So I'm Meg Thomas. I am Deputy CEO and Policy Lead at Forces Children Scotland, and I'm going to be acting as chair today because the other 4 people in the room definitely have far more expertise in this area than I do. So Nicole, will I start with you to introduce yourself?
Yeah, sure. Hi everyone, my name is Nicole. I'm a participation worker for the Nexus project at the Children's Society, and I work with young carers and our Forces families, making their voice heard.
Right. Linda, will I come to you?
You certainly can. Hello, everybody. My name is Lynn. I also work on the Nexus project with Nicole. I'm the service manager at the Children's Society. And I don't know what else to say at this point, so that's me.
Thanks, Lynn. Jude.
Yep. Hello, everyone. My name's Judith Blair, or Jude. I am the Learning and Development Worker for Forces Children Scotland, and for my sons, I'm also a military spouse. And yeah, I've been loving working at Forces Children Scotland. I've started on the same day as Meg, so we've been here for over just a year now. So.
Great, thanks, Jude. And last but not least, Nina even.
The new name.
The new name.
Hi, everyone. I'm Nina Collins. I'm the Participation Manager with Forces Children Scotland. As Meg will allude to later, I also have a bit of a background in working with young carers. So I worked for 5 young carers for a number of years before popping over to this role.
Great, okay. So what we're planning to do today is we've got a series of questions that we have developed in advance that I'll be posing to different people around their areas expertise, and then at the end give you all an opportunity to come in with any questions you have or observations. So if you wouldn't mind in this first section just staying on mute, if you want to pop some questions in the chat as they occur to you, please use the chat function. I certainly sometimes think I've got a good question and then I forget it by the time the questions come up. So just pop them in the chat and we can come back to them at any point. So Jude, I'm going to start with you if that's okay. Could you just give us all, because there's some people in the room who will be very familiar with Forces Life. There'll be some others that this is new to. So could you just give us a brief background and introduction to life in an armed forces family from your lived experience and some of the key terminology we might use today? You're on mute, Jude.
Here we go. Hopefully you can hear me now. Sorry about that. So it's good to just give a bit of context before we go into the specific needs of armed forces children and young people who have a caring role. So being a child from an armed forces family offers unique experiences that shapes their character and worldview in profound ways. And when considering the lived experiences of armed forces children, we can take a balanced look at both the positives and challenges faced by them. And I think it's really important to know, just before we start the discussions, the importance of intersection. in no way what we're seeing today, if we're giving examples, are saying this is what happens to a child or young person in an armed forces family, or this is exactly what happens to an armed forces child who has a caring role. It's really, really important that you are aware of that intersection. Every family is different, every family has different beliefs, and every family is from different cultures and societies. So just to be very aware of that. But first, let's really address some of the positive experiences of being an armed forces child. So the first one is their ability sometimes to adapt and sometimes the ability to bounce back. So armed forces children learn to be adaptable from a very early age. Regular relocations teach them to adjust to new environments. They make friends quickly and find their footing in unfamiliar situations. And these can be skills that serve them well throughout their life. There's also cultural exposure. So many armed forces families experience postings around the world, which gives forces children first-hand experience of experiencing cultures, languages and ways of life. And you could argue that this global perspective fosters open-mindedness and cultural sensitivity that can sometimes be difficult to gain otherwise. Another positive of being an armed forces child and young person is strong community bonds. So military communities often create tight-knit support systems, which I miss because I'm no longer on the patch. But living on the patch and family support groups provide a sense of belonging and understanding from others experiencing similar circumstances. You could also say a positive aspect of being a child from a forces family is that it does foster independence and responsibility. So when a parent deploys or if they go on operations and they're separated from their serving parent, children often take on additional responsibilities at home, which for some children can foster independence, leadership skills and maturity beyond their years. But obviously these are all fantastic positives that can come about from being an armed forces child, but there are some challenges that they do face. So frequent locations is the first one I'd like to mention, which is sometimes referred to as mobility in the forces community. So moving every 2 to 3 years means repeatedly leaving friends, schools and familiar surroundings. Children must rebuild social networks and families have to build social networks as well and adapt to new educational systems, which can be quite emotionally taxing. The second challenge that I'd like to identify is parental separation. So deployments when serving parents are away on extended tours or operational exercises. Separation can also occur in the form of weekending, where the serving parent will be away during the week but will return to the family home at the weekends. And all these forms of separation can create extended absences from the serving parent, and sometimes this can be during significant life events like birthdays, even giving birth. So this can be a challenge for armed forces children and families. And it can also obviously create additional stress in family dynamics as well. Educational continuity is another challenge which armed forces children and young people face. So changing schools frequently can create gaps in education as different schools have varying curriculums and standards, and armed forces children may need to catch up or repeat when transferring between schools. And I think finally, the thing I would just like to highlight, which can be a challenge, we spoke about that intersection at the start, but I suppose a big challenge is identity development. So the question, where are you from? It can be quite complicated for armed forces children who may have lived in multiple places. And this can make identity formation more complex as they might not have a singular hometown connection. But going back to that strong community bond, that is very evident within the armed forces community. So they do have that, but it may be sometimes difficult for them to identify where they are from. So Armed Forces children carry both the weight and the gifts of their unique upbringing, and they can develop a bounce back attitude while facing meaningful challenges that shape them into really adaptable, worldly individuals. And this year, actually, for Month of the Military Child, we are really focusing in on these amazing strengths of the children and young people that we work with. So hopefully that's just given you a little bit of a background between around some of the positives and challenges that children and young people from this community might face. Hope that was helpful.
Excellent. Thanks, Jude. Very helpful. So always good to understand what we're talking about, because that intersectionality is really important for us to do. So you've talked a little bit about Forces children. Nina, I'm going to come to you just now. So having had a wealth of experience working with Fife young carers and also working with young carers from Armed Forces families, what does it mean to be a young carer in today's world? How might their daily lives differ from other young people their age? Sort of what kind of responsibilities might they have and what challenges might they face? So just have a sense of just generally young carers out there, not necessarily Forces young carers. That would be helpful.
Yeah, happy to do that. So I suppose when thinking about young carers, just thinking about kind of like the tasks that they might do. So what does a caring role look like? And I have to be honest, before I took up the role with young carers in Fife, didn't really understand what that meant for a young person. And I suppose any of the people on the call, and I know there's some people who have quite extensive experience of working with young carers, and you may have been the same as me before you did that role, was kind of thinking, oh, well, surely not, they wouldn't do that. But actually, the list is very long. So it might be things like practical tasks. So it might be about cooking and housework. It might be about doing the shopping, not just like a wee, can you go to the shop? Like you might ask, like I might ask my two, could you nip to the shop to get this or that? It's about doing the weekly shop. You know, it's about taking responsibility for that shopping and make sure you've got everything in the house that you need to keep the household going. It might include personal care. And this is, I suppose, before I worked with young carers, this was the bit that I was like, really? Really, is this what young people are doing? So washing and dressing could be an adult or a sibling. It's about maybe shaving somebody as well. You know, it might be if you're caring for a parent and that parent is your dad, that one of your tasks is shaving them. It might be actually dressing your parent or your sibling. Could be like physical kind of care, so like helping people get about. So it might be actually supporting somebody to get out of bed. It might be actually pushing somebody in a wheelchair. I suppose that's the vision that we have of a caring role quite often, but that might be your task, and that can be quite onerous on a young person. Also providing emotional support, so supporting somebody who's not feeling so great. And we can imagine what that can be like depending on the circumstances. And that can be a really, really young person. So definitely when I worked for Fife Carers, there was young people, really young people who were caring for a parent who had poor mental health, and they were supporting them with their well-being. It might be about managing budget. Normally, some of the older ones were doing that. So managing a household budget, making sure that like the bills were paid. Also administrating medication. And actually, when I worked in Fife, we did a whole project working with pharmacies around young people and really understanding about medications, because they were responsible for making sure that potentially a parent or their sibling were taking the medication and actually administrating them correctly. So we did a lot of work with pharmacies, especially when we brought in the young carers authorisation card and young people were showing their card to pick up medications, and we felt really we needed to make sure that these young people understood what these medications were. And also it's about looking after siblings, which I know a lot of young people do alongside other caring tasks that they have. So they might have a parent or a sibling who has an illness or disability, and maybe when their parent is seeing to the child with a disability, they're looking after the rest of the siblings and making sure that they're safe. So I mean, I suppose for some young people it's all of the above or some of the above. It kind of depends on the family and what the family's support needs are. And I suppose just thinking about putting that in context, thinking about what does it look like for a young carer. I suppose every day is different, But what always used to strike me was like young people, I used to compare and say a lot to my young people, my children. Like if you were a young carer, you know, you're asking, oh, can you do this? Can you do a bit of washing up or whatever? And they'd be like, okay, you know, especially when they're teenagers. And they used to get what they called the young carer lecture quite a lot. So kind of like, can you feed a pet? And if you don't feed that pet, if you're a young carer, you have to do that. You know, if Michael, my son, didn't do the dishes well, you know, after a bit of nagging, he might do it. But if he didn't do it, then that was fine. Somebody else in the house could do that task. But actually, in a caring role, if that pet doesn't get fed by the young carer, then potentially nobody else is able to pick that up. It's about when the shopping's needing done, but the shopping's getting done when your pals are away to play footy at the park on a nice day after school. So it's kind of putting that in context that these tasks definitely need doing. And that actually those tasks need to fit in with everything else about being a child or young person. So actually there's a push out on the things that are actually about being a young person today. So taking on those responsibilities doesn't leave space for some of those things around being a young person, that actually you've got to juggle and maneuver things in your life that are really important to you and you have a right to, but actually you've got these really important tasks that you need to do in your caring role.
It's really helpful, Nina. And the rights bit I'm going to come back to. So I've got a couple of questions about that because I've been struck that some of the conversations in spaces recently have been things like blanket bans on mobile phones. And what does that mean for young carers or young people being excluded from public spaces? I know one of the shopping centres here in Glasgow had faced some level of violence and disruption from just a really small handful of young people, but their solution to that was to ban all young people under the age of 16 after 3 o'clock in the afternoon with no consideration. So I'm going to come back, keep that in mind, Nina, because I'm going to come back to what do we think we need to do to keep young carers in mind for some of those. Nicole, I'm going to come to you now to weave these two bits together. So Jude's given us a lovely description of what Force's life looks like, and Nina's given us a description of what being a young carer looks like. But I'm hoping that you will be able to tell us about what life might be like for a young person who provides care for someone in an armed forces family. So weaving those two themes together, how could their experiences of be shaped by both their caring responsibility and Force's life? And how does that maybe look a little different from a Force's young carer as opposed to a young carer in other parts of society?
Yeah, absolutely. And it is kind of exactly what you just said. It's everything Jude said and everything Nina said kind of bundled together for one young person to manage. So a lot of the young carers and armed forces families we work with will have a lot of the same experiences as other young carers, or the things that Nina just mentioned. But there might be additional responsibilities or additional factors that might be really good and be opportunities for them, but might also make their lives a bit more challenging. So they might care for someone who is serving or has served, and they might be caring because of something related to them having served in the armed forces. But a lot of the young carers we work with care for other parents who haven't been in the armed forces or siblings, and they have someone else in the family who's in the armed forces. But yeah, as I said, there's some extra things added in that other young carers might not need to manage, such as deployments is a big one, having a parent go away. Lots of young carers we work with have intermittent caring roles that might start when a parent leaves, or it might start when a parent comes home. And I've seen videos by Forces Scotland before that's from young people in our forces families talking about disruption of routine and how difficult that can be. And that's kind of amplified for young carers who can be kind of launched into these intense caring roles almost overnight. And of course, aside from that, there's the emotional impact of having a family member deployed that any young person would feel, not being able to maintain regular contact, having gaps in contact, not knowing how long they'll be away. And on top of that, having to care for someone at home or know that you're going to have to care for someone when they come back. Another challenge could be postings. It can be hard for any child to move away, but it's hard for young care when the support network they might rely on to help them in their caring role, or the people that know what they're going through, taken away, especially when moving might mean going to another country, It could have an emotional toll as on any young person, but especially for a young carer who might rely on those support services. And then there's also the practical difficulties of moving, things like finances, admin, might for young carers and armed forces families who move regularly. That might be a bit more of a challenge for them. When a family moves, they might take on the kind of tasks of moving schools, registering addresses for bills, joining GPs, and waiting lists, which obviously if they're a young carer and that there's someone who needs that support in the family can be even more stressful. And of course, finding young carer support as well and registering for that young carer support, and kind of experiencing that gap in support when they move areas when it's probably a time when they really do need that support the most. Building new relationships, as I've said, I keep saying for young people that's difficult, but for young carers who really rely on the support and the people around them, that can be even more difficult. And again, with postings, the responsibility for practically moving, clearing the house, especially if there's someone that you're caring for at the same time, that can be really difficult. And in terms of kind of the experiences, it can have a big impact on young carers, and the experiences that they have. So I've realised, I think I've spoken quite a bit about the struggles that being a young carer in armed forces can have, but there are positives and negatives. We find that young carers we work with really enjoy their caring role, they like spending time with their loved ones, they feel pride around it, but it can have impacts on things like time and schooling. That's what the young carers we work with have said to us. Another positive is support that young carers and armed forces families have. Lots of bases have welfare officers, they have hive workers, youth workers, and as Jude said, there's a sense of community. So there is a positive in that as well. One of the other impacts I just wanted to touch on was how soon the young carers are identified. So we know that Young Carers Alliance say that young carers are usually caring for 3 years before they're identified. And although there's no specific research on young carers and armed forces families and whether that could impact it, we'd kind of make a bit of an assumption that it could, as they're moving areas more regularly, moving between different local authorities, and also relationships such with teachers who are these crucial people who can identify young carers. That's switching up a lot more than for other young carers it might be. So it might take a bit more time to kind of spot the signs that someone's a young carer. And I wanted to pick up on you touched on strength and understanding in your question, because I feel like young carers and armed forces families definitely use their strength to manage all the kind of challenges I've just spoken about. We've met young carers that have moved countries whilst caring, they've moved away from family whilst caring, started new schools and made new friends, and they overcome these challenges really well. And 9 times out of 10, they still speak about their caring role with positivity, despite this. And I'd say the young carers that we currently work with in armed forces families, they're aged 8 to 17, the ones that we work with. And they're all such accepting and welcoming people. And despite the big age gap, they get on so well with each other, whether it's an 8-year-old with a 17-year-old or one's closer in age. I think part of that does come from the shared experiences they have, and the unique experiences that they all have, which kind of brings them together.
Thanks, Nicole. At the parliamentary debate last week, one of the MSPs particularly brought out that bit of love and the fact that, that's the bit that binds them all, that these young people do it because they love the person that they're caring for. And I think that's where that strength and positivity, I think, fundamentally comes from, doesn't it? But I think it's helpful to have that think about what does it look like from that forces perspective. And I wonder whether if a young person from a forces family is in a school where there's a large number of forces children already, just this assumption that actually it's just like everyone else when their parent is deployed or that they're starting to do a posting, and yes, children need to step up and do a little bit more responsibility. So I imagine that adds to that sense of perhaps not identifying young carers in forces families, just this assumption that that's just part of forces life.
Yeah, definitely. We talk a lot about identity with our young carers, and there's definitely a thing of trying to merge all these different identities that they might have together into one. So yeah, definitely.
That's really powerful, isn't it? That sense of identity and how important that is.
Mm.
I think, I was a social worker to training years ago, and I think before we really understood about young carers, there was this sense of we just need to go in and take those caring responsibilities off the young person, and not understanding how important it was to their identity. And actually, how do you do that in partnership with them to say which bits of these are really important for you to keep hold of, and how do we just make sure that it's not too much, that it's not having a detrimental or negative effect, and working with them. So I think, yeah, bringing out that point in identity is a really important one. So thanks, Nicole.
Mm.
Um, Jude, I'm going to come to you, and Lynn, I'm going to pose some of this question as well, if you can, after Jude, to give us the English context. But Jude, how does the Scottish policy landscape recognise and respond to the unique needs of young carers in armed forces background? What framework, services, supports might exist to help young people navigate those dual roles of being a young carer and a forces young person? And in what ways are the current systems working well? And I think once you've done the Scottish context, Lynn, it would be really helpful if you could explain potentially how that differs in an English context, because what we know is forces children move between the jurisdictions really frequently, and that can definitely add to some of the challenges they experience.
Yeah. Yep. Well, I think it's important to state, first of all, Scotland has developed robust general support systems for young carers. But as we've heard, those from armed forces families face unique circumstances, as Nicole was mentioning, that require specialised approaches. And this intersection creates distinctive challenges and opportunities within existing frameworks. The first framework I'd like to emphasise is obviously the Armed Forces Covenant. So it provides the foundational framework for supporting armed forces families in Scotland. And while it's not specifically targeted at young carers, it establishes several key principles, including no disadvantage should come from military service, special consideration is appropriate in some cases, and local authorities should consider the needs of the armed forces community. And I think it's also important to know that although it was an act in 2011, it gained further legal weight through the introduction of the Armed Forces Covenant duty, which came into effect in 2022. And the duty is really important because it took what was a guiding framework and made aspects of it into binding law. So this means that education, housing and health sectors in Scotland have a legal responsibility to ensure armed forces families, including young carers, do not face further disadvantage. And as we've already discussed, young carers from armed forces families often experience additional complexities, including frequent relocations, which, as Nicole mentioned, disrupts support and services. So they may also be caring for someone, they could be caring with someone who has combat-related physical injuries or mental health conditions requiring specialised care. And it has also been identified that, and as Nicole said, it usually takes about 3 years, as she mentioned. It's been identified that the somewhat armed forces culture of self-sufficiency may also discourage some young carers seeking help or even identifying themselves as carers. But one act in Scotland that does help support these specific challenges is the Carers Scotland Act of 2016. And the Act created a comprehensive legal framework to support young carers in Scotland. And the key elements of this Act include, first and foremost, the legal recognition. So the Act formally defines young carers as individuals under 18 or 18 and over if they're still in education. Secondly, it provides something called a young carer statement, which establishes a legal right to assessment that identifies the nature and the impact of caring responsibilities, whether caring is appropriate for their age and personal outcomes and support needs. And the Act also requires local authorities to develop specific strategies addressing young carer identification, prevention of any inappropriate caring and service development. And And there are some gaps to that, which I could mention just now, Meg, if you want, unless you want to hear a wee bit from Linda. But there are some setbacks that could be identified from the Act.
I think that's, yep.
Yeah. So, and I think we've noted it on our call to action, which we presented to Parliament last week. But implementation from the Act does reveal several gaps for armed forces families. So the first is the young carers statement. The statements that are provided by the Act. So while all young carers are entitled to a young carer statement, frequent relocations mean armed forces children often fall through administrative gaps between local authorities. There's also transferability challenges. So the support packages don't always transfer smoothly when families relocate to new bases or postings. And finally, as I briefly mentioned, identification barriers. So military culture sometimes discourages disclosure of caring responsibilities, making identification difficult. I'll briefly just talk about, I think it's really important, about educational policy. And there's several fantastic support mechanisms that exist which can benefit young carers from armed forces families. So the first is GIRFIC, which is Getting It Right for Every Child. And this framework helps support children from armed forces backgrounds, which links into the Additional Support for Learning Scotland Act of 2004, so the ASL Act, which provides the legal framework for identifying and addressing the additional support needs of children who may face barriers to learning. And children from armed forces families are mentioned specifically in this Act. And this Act helps support young armed forces children who are young carers because it provides them a right to an assessment of their needs, appropriate support plans, and coordinated support plans in more complex places, and transitions planning when moving between schools or areas, although that doesn't always happen. And finally, I just really quickly want to touch upon the UNCRC. I think I'd get into trouble if I didn't. But the UNCRC Convention on the Rights of the Child provides a framework that supports young armed forces children who are young carers in Scotland through several key articles. And I think it's important to highlight how important the UNCRC is at the moment in Scotland, as incorporation has just happened in Scotland. So some of the articles that the UNCRC supports for young carers is Article 31, so the right to rest and leisure. So this recognises their need for play and recreation despite their caring duties. Article 3, the best interests of the child, so ensuring decisions affecting these children prioritise their well-being, acknowledging their dual vulnerabilities of being an armed forces child and a young carer. Article 12, the right to be heard, which guarantees these children can express views on matters affecting them, which they did wonderfully last week at the Parliament. Articles 28 and 29, so the right to an education, so this protects their educational rights despite disruption from military relocations and caring responsibilities. And Article 24, the right to health, so it ensures access to appropriate healthcare services. So what I would say is it's clear that there are a number of frameworks and policies in place to support young carers from armed forces families. However, young carers from armed forces families remain particularly difficult to identify. So although Scotland has strong examples of collaboration between military and caring organisations, and we have really, really good partnerships and links, the division between reserved and devolved powers creates complications. So the MOD services operate under UK-wide frameworks, while carer support is devolved. So healthcare may be provided through both NHS Scotland and MOD medical services, and education transitions between different UK education systems create additional complications. There's also geographic disparities where support can vary significantly based on location. And so you could say that young carers from armed forces families in Scotland occupy a unique position at the intersection of two policy frameworks. So while both armed forces support and young carer services are relatively developed individually, the specific combination of needs remains it needs for maybe a wee bit more work, but it's tricky. So, but what I would say is the strengths of Scotland's approach include really strong legislative frameworks that are there and emerging cross-sector collaboration like our webinar today, which is great. But there are significant challenges that remain in identification, coordination and addressing these specific caring needs. So hopefully we're on the right path, and these policies that are there will help lead the way in making even more change from what we heard at the debate last week. So.
Great. And I know you're going to come and tell us about what was in the debate a bit later on. I think
exciting.
the only thing I'd note is the Additional Support for Learning Act also specifically mentions young carers. So
yes,
if a young person from a forces family hasn't been identified as a forces family, they may be picked up through that. So they're also mentioned there. Lynn, really curious to know how much of that is paralleled in England Shire, or how much of that looks incredibly different.
Yeah, there's definitely plenty of parallels there. It's quite interesting to hear Jude talk about it, because some of it I'm like, yeah, I know that, and then oh no, that doesn't fit. So there's lots that kind of runs the same, and then there is some differences. I'll pick up, I think, start with on education, because in England, I was at a conference last week and we were actually talking about this. Is the common transfer file, which is developed so that when a child moves from one school to another, that information goes with them. A school's expected to complete it, and that's being expected to be sent on. However, there are already many problems with it in that it's only expected by local authority schools. It's not part of the devolved nations. So whilst we've got this great little file that exists and would be very helpful to children and young people from armed forces families, it isn't really being utilised in the way that it should be. It's not being used, and it's not being completed well when it is completed. So there's lots of kind of issues. They've got a really good starting point, but actually there needs to be much more in terms of conversations with Wales and Scotland, and conversations with academies and free schools to kind of look at how that can actually be expanded to work successfully across the board. And obviously that's not set up specifically for armed forces families, but it is of great benefit to them. And what we're kind of doing within Nexus is then looking at that next step. So we've got the common transfer file. It would be really great if that was rolled out successfully across the board, but then please can we add in a tick box about are they a young carer, because there's already a tab in there about are they from an armed forces family, and that can be completed. But then there is the additional, is there a young carer? And very much that's kind of what we're trying to ease out of things at the moment, is to find those little bits where actually if you could add that in, then that would be a very comprehensive package to support both children and young people from armed forces families and young carers, and therefore for us that both basically. Other things in terms of armed forces families is all the same things around the covenant. The obvious additional thing in England is that the children and young people until the age of, I think it's 16, are entitled to their pupil premium. So there's a service child premium that each child is entitled to, and they continue to be entitled to that after their family member has left the military for a further 5 years. So it's not a huge amount of money, and obviously it depends if you're at a school where there's only 1 or 2 or 3 children and young people from armed forces families. It's a very small amount, and therefore there's just a small thing offered to those children and young people, often in the form of a school uniform payment. If you go to a big school where there is lots of children and young people from armed forces families, then that then totals quite a big amount of money, which then means often that money can be spent to employ somebody that can be an armed forces family support worker, for example. We've had contact with them, and the difference that's made when you've got those people in posts is incredible. They are the ones that can identify the young carers. They're the ones that have conversations with families when they arrive to learn about what's happened up until then, what support they've had before, what kind of schooling they've had, what can be offered in place. So the difference there in terms of what that money can do is quite substantial, I would say. And but again, at this conference last week, there's lots of conversations about those small schools, and therefore, if there's not a huge amount of children and young people from armed forces families, then it's not really kind of being focused on. So in the same way that we tend to find that young carers from armed forces families isn't particularly focused on, because everyone's like, well, there's not very many, and we're like, well, okay, but if nobody's focused on they're not very many, then we're not going to identify them. And I think that's the same if you've just got 5 children in your school from an armed forces family, then less attention, less is focus on them, because maybe the school hasn't got the time to prioritize that and to learn about those experiences. So that's from an armed forces perspective. From a young carers perspective, it sounds very similar. We had the Care Act in 2014 that introduced the idea of a young carer from an armed, sorry, I'm getting confused and I do this a lot, so I apologise. But that brought in the term young carer so that it began to separate out to a child in need from a young carer, and so we could focus a little bit on their unique responsibilities. But I think Jude covered exceptionally well all of that area, and in terms of needs assessments that are also carried out here, so very similar in that regard.
I am assuming though that if we have a problem with local authority transferring across jurisdictions, that it's potentially an even more complicated transferring a young carer statement or the English equivalent into Scotland and vice versa. So, I mean, in Scotland, it's each local authority that does the young carers statement. So it would shift, it would have to change even if they just move from Edinburgh to Lossiemouth, for example, or to Kinloss. But so I imagine it's even more difficult if we're talking cross-border.
Definitely, yeah. I mean, it's exactly the same problem. We're working with Plymouth at the moment, and they were talking about like how they haven't really given much thought to how a needs assessment would be transferred from one place to another, because actually they're developed so locally to the support systems that are available. And so, yeah, you've got the issue of transferring them from county to county, but then to go from one type of support system to another type of support system, managing that transfer between Scotland and England, yeah, just adds an extra complication to that process.
And when we were doing our rights report, we did hear from some young people who definitely made that decision as a family to stay put and look at weekending because it actually became too hard. They had a really good package. They'd finally got to a place that they had a really good package, both for themselves as young carers, but for the person they were caring for, and thought, actually, that's it, we're not moving, and that weekending. But of course, that ironically then puts even more pressure on the young person, because that Monday to Friday, or as we know, weekending has tended to be monthing rather than so, because for financial reasons and distance. So I imagine that that's an additional challenge in there as well.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, I think it's the families that we've spoken to, and sometimes they've got really good support and they're incredibly positive about the support systems that they've got in place. And then you can speak to somebody that's at a base half an hour away with a totally different experience and doesn't feel supported and doesn't think that there's any support in place. So I can entirely appreciate why people choose to settle somewhere if they get the support that they need, because it's so difficult to come by, and the knowledge that if you move to somewhere new, that's all going to be lost, and the energy that you've got to put into starting again with that process, it just, even thinking about it, feels inordinate. So I can really understand why families would maybe choose not to go through that if they can.
Yeah, really helpful. So, Lynn, you are about a year and a half or halfway into the Nexus project. I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about the Nexus project, and then what insights you have to share from what you've learnt in this first half of the project, and I guess what learning can we take from the project to into the Scottish context or into other places where you aren't working. It'd be really interesting to hear about what you've been doing.
I'm excited to tell you. So so Nexus has reached its halfway point. So I'm busy burrowed away writing the report. So hopefully it's all fresh in my mind. But we started 18 months ago by running a pilot project in Oxfordshire. So we thought it was probably best to ease ourselves into this project. And so we started working in Oxfordshire. We built up some relationships with the RAF and the Army. So the RAF community support team and the Army Welfare Service community support team in that area. And then we just started to network and network and network, because the one thing that we'd been told, the Children's Society had previously done another very small armed forces piece of research project, and the thing that they kind of reiterated to us at the start was the team involved with that, it's going to be really hard to find these young people. And so we had that very much in our minds, that we've got to go and find young carers from armed forces families, and they are very hidden, and we've got to go through that process of finding them. So we wanted to speak to as many professionals as we could, as it enable us to begin to identify. And every meeting that we had, every webinar that we did, there would generally be that moment where they would say, oh, with this family, and then they'd give us a description of a child or young person that was in a caring role, and we'd be like, yes, that family fits. And so it's that process, that light bulb moment of actually, oh yeah, we've been working with this family, and all of a sudden joining those dots up and saying, and therefore we're looking after this family because there's a child or an adult with additional needs or a disability, and actually that means that that child or young person is caring. So it was almost that first step for us, was to meet with as many professionals as possible and enable them to go through that process of identification. And it just showed that once you put young carers onto people's radar and you get them to think about it, then it's just that added thing. Then they know, oh, okay, when I go into a family and I'm supporting them, if I identify someone as having a disability or additional need, it's just that extra question. Is there any children or young people, and do they have caring responsibilities? And then it might just be the next simple step of saying, okay, would you like us to refer you to the local young carers service? I mean, in our instance, we're like, refer them to us. We want to speak to them. But that was definitely the first point that we were very focused on, is working with professionals through that identification process. And then very slowly but steadily, we began to get referrals come in to us, and Nicole was able to build the first Oxford Youth Voice group, which was made up of 4 or 5 young people from Oxfordshire who had caring responsibilities. And what we really want to do in this project is to learn from the young people. So we want to have conversations with them, and Nicole just provides millions of different ways of talking to you. Armed Forces identity, their young carers identity, and then all those other identities that are also sitting around, that she can then just learn from them about their different experiences, about what it's like, about the positives, the negatives, the things that are incredibly frustrating when they actually just want to vent and say, actually, this is horrible and I hate this, or my school doesn't support me. And so just listening to those young people, and then from that beginning to collect and learn and pick up the themes that are really coming through, that we can then say, okay, these are the themes. And then those lovely professionals that we spoke to very early on in the project, we then pull them back in and we say, okay, these are the themes that the young people are raising with us. These are the issues. These are the things that they are saying are a problem, or actually these are the things that are saying are going really well. And then we talk to the professionals about how can we replicate these things? Can we do anything additional to support with this issue? And we kind of then work with the professionals to kind of identify some goals, and then we work together in that area to begin to meet those goals. So as I said, we started in Oxfordshire. We then moved to Hampshire, and then we began, I want to say we got lucky, because I think we did get lucky in that we found that there was already a young carers, the Army Welfare Service were running a young carers group for children and young people in armed forces families in partnership with London. So we were also still recruiting and going through that process, but we also really wanted to capture this brilliant project, because we're like, this is a great project and we want to be able to share this project elsewhere, to say like how this can be done and how it can be successful. And one of the things that we found from this project was that Nicole ran an activity day in partnership with them, and from that one activity day they went go-karting, they did some youth voice work in the afternoon, they had an incredibly good time, and then word of mouth spread, and all of a sudden you've got children, young people that were once upon a time hidden and we couldn't find them, coming to say to their community development worker, I'm a young carer, or parents saying to the workers, we think my child's a young carer, is there any way that they can access this support too? Because once it's there and once it's positive and it's not hidden and it's not stigma, then it becomes something that's to be celebrated. And so all of a sudden we saw this real switch, and Nicole has just started doing a youth voice group with this group, and there's 13 young people signed up to it. So we've gone from like this very small group to all of a sudden Nicole's got to manage all these young people talking at the same time. So it's just an incredible change to see how actually when this becomes on people's radar, once it becomes a positive story, then that changes the plot line, and it means that actually then young carers can be celebrated and they can look forwards to things, and there can be something positive about that. And so I think that's kind of, so I've kind of brought you through the journey of kind of where we are now. And Nicole has been working with the young people to develop resources that we can begin to share, and that the young people have said that they think would be useful. So we're working on a web page. We've created posters that any armed forces base can put up that just promotes their local young carers service, because something as simple as making it or putting it on a notice board just brings it into people's thought processes. And so it's we're looking at little things that we can do that don't put a huge amount of pressure on professionals, because we appreciate that everybody is already very busy. And so what small things can we do that are helpful, that then can be utilised in order to improve support. I don't know if that answers your question, Meg, but
no, that's really helpful, Lynn. And I think it's right, isn't it? It's taking the stigma out of this and saying, actually, this is something to be very proud of, and take some of the fear out. Because I think a lot of young carers are really scared that someone will come in and take that identity away. They will just, like that sort of early experience I had of young carers as a social worker. So taking the stigma out, providing some reassurance that we're here around supporting you, not taking away the things that are important to you, and what that looks like strikes me as being really important, and that importance of being heard, actually knowing that once identified they can ask for the support they want and it comes is really key, isn't it? Which, you know, from a children's rights perspective is so important. I'm going to come back to you though. I've got a little bit of a question around what does it look like for those children who are transitioning to veteran status, because so much of the activity is around the bases, but we know for some families they will transition to veteran status but stay put, but for many they move out of those communities. And what we also know is if the veteran status is coming in an unplanned way, perhaps due to a medical discharge, the likelihood of the young person's caring responsibilities increasing is quite significant at a time that they have a change in their identity, because they're suddenly not a forces child, at a time when so much of what you talked about there was really good value support from like the AWS workers or the equivalent, you know, RNFPS and things. So what does it look like for these young people at that point of transition to veteran status, and what support is there for them?
It's an excellent question, Meg. And actually, as I said, in terms of us trying to find young people from armed forces families to speak to, that veteran young people is still our outstanding question mark. It's one of our focuses as we move forwards, because actually, despite the fact that we have done lots of talking around veterans and that we really want to talk to veteran children and young people, it seems to be it's the next step of difficult in this process, because, as you've said, they've lost all of those support systems that they've had in place, and all of the people that have armed forces on their radar almost have almost gone from their lives. So those people are not identifying them So it might be that they're getting young carers support, but they might not be getting the armed forces element. So it's definitely, I wish I could answer your question more fully, Meg, because I can't yet, but we're really on the lookout now. If anyone on the call knows of any veteran young carers, then do say so, because that's definitely an area that we would like to focus our attention on next. I would also say that, oh, I've lost my trail of thought now. In terms of veteran, we were in a conversation. We've been looking at the Armed Forces Covenant with a Young Carers Service and the Navy down in Plymouth. And one of the things that we talked about was looking at that. That at the moment there doesn't seem to be anyone that supports through that transition period. So it's almost like we talked a bit about, like, if you're on a base and the community worker on that base kind of knows that they're moving on to somewhere new. So you kind of go, okay, the Armed Forces Support Services on that camp will pick up on this and they will carry on. But actually, when you're moving out into Civvy Street, that doesn't happen. That support is almost lost immediately. And so at the moment, I just don't think there is. It's almost a wider issue as well in terms of actually supporting young people through that transition. And I know from your videos that you've been looking at this in Scotland anyway. And I definitely think it's something of a wider thing that needs conversation, but also then honing in on this young carers element, especially if they've become a young carer for the reasons that they're like just at that very end point where they're leaving. So we're definitely quite keen to kind of speak to children, young people from that world, but also to have those kind of to think about it from a policy perspective and a systems change perspective in terms of what needs to happen to support that transition out for those young people, just to make sure that someone's tracking that through and it's being offered. And I think that's a really important kind of next step for Nexus in terms of looking at that and what changes can we encourage both within the armed forces community and outside within schools and things.
It strikes me that potentially definitely a conversation for after this webinar, but how do we influence the like of the Joint Service Protocol 770 so that at the points of both all transitions there is a young carer question in there, so that the person supporting that transition is asking, do you have a young carer in your family, and raising that awareness, but particularly at that point of transitioning out, that there is a question about a young carer there and what that plans. So I think there's definitely a piece of work we can be doing together on that one, Lynn, that we can pick up after this call.
Excellent.
Yes, absolutely. Always love it when a plan comes together. Nina, can I come on to you, because you did some work when you came to Forces Children Scotland, because you had that experience of being at Fife Young Carers, where we did an online survey to understand, and you did a piece of work, a really interesting piece of work with Fife Young Carers. Do you want to tell us about what kinds of initiatives and programs that have been developed in Scotland, how they made a difference for young people, and just what research stories or examples have we got around how we've supported young carers from Forces families?
Yeah, happy to. So yeah, I started at Forces Children Scotland. It was called Royal Caledonian Education Trust in those days, and in 2018. And at that point, I suppose we had just started our policy work, so our policy officer then was new into post, and we were looking for research and thinking, what do we know about anything about armed forces young people in general? But obviously, once you work with young carers, they embed swiftly around your heart. So yeah, I had that hat on, thinking, what about armed forces and armed forces young carers? What if you've got a caring role and you're in an armed forces family? And so we did a survey based on the health behaviours in school survey. So pulled the questions from that, because they're all research-based questions, and we added in the young carers questions, so young carers survey questions. And actually, we were really interested in those results. So our responses weren't massive. We had 162 respondents, but 29% of those said that they had a caring role. And 34% of those young people who said they had a caring role had indicated that they had what we would class, looking at the results, as a very high caring responsibilities. So we thought that was really significant, even though our numbers were small. And then also, as part of that survey, the other questions that young people were answering further down the survey, so they weren't saying, tick, yes, I'm a young carer, but actually the responses to other questions in the survey, we were like, actually, you haven't said you're a young carer. But when we looked and analysed the survey answers, we were like, we actually think you do have a young carer. So the numbers were significant in that small sample to say that it had a caring role. So I suppose in terms of that, we were like, we need to think about young carers in an armed forces family. So that's linked to all, like, in our policy work that we're still doing now. So that was kind of the kick-off point, I suppose, in terms of that. As a result of that, we developed an Armed Forces Young Carers grant. So we support young people who have a caring role, specifically by providing them an opportunity to apply for funding for us so that they can have a respite break, whatever that is. And it might be, I always love this example, it might be a shed, money for a shed so that they can do their drumming in the shed. That's their respite. They can choose basically what works for them without annoying everybody with the drumming. As a parent who had a drummer in the house for a little while, that's a really good one. I wish I'd thought of that and put him in the shed long ago. And also, following that, we did some work about exploring those experiences. So you're really hearing, but like Nicole is doing, hearing from the experiences of young people about their caring role. So we reached out through the Scottish Young Carers Service Alliance network, and we worked with young people in Helensburgh, Moray and Fife to kind of hear more about their experiences. So it was COVID time, so we did those sessions online and heard from those different areas, because I wanted to make sure that we were listening to different young people in the tri-service and really listen to about their experiences. And that led on to a project that we did with Fife Young Carers. So we worked with young people thinking about how can we highlight, having worked in Fife, I knew we did not get the referrals from Armed Forces Young Carers that you would expect. So we have Rosyth and Lookers, and we just didn't get the numbers. We had a couple, but it, as the whole population of Fife, it was not what we would expect. But we know the reasons why. So definitely working with those young people, they told us about some of the barriers, about them kind of putting their head above the parapet and saying, actually, from an armed forces family, I have a caring role. And the young people decided that a really good way to do that was to work with Fife Young Carers and to put out a poster campaign. So the young people designed a poster that would identify that intersectionality, a young carer and in a forces family. And we signposted them to both organisations, because young people told us it's really important that we had that dual signposting. So around a service, because at that, we don't have a service specifically for Armed Forces Young Carers. Fife Young Carers is a fantastic service in Fife. So around support needs and a referral to Young Carers Service, and then also to come to us around participation work, but also about support from the grant. So young people developed that posters. It's out across Fife to signpost young people, and actually definitely in terms of both the grants and the Young Carers support through Fife Young Carers, that's been really, really successful. But also for the young people, actually them being recognised as having a caring role in a forces family and having an opportunity to talk about their unique experiences, and for them also to be doing something about that. So having an opportunity to be part of recognising some of those unique challenges, celebrating the fantastic, amazing experiences that those young people have, and definitely that thing about that bit of love. So, and all the skills that young people gain when they have a caring role. So that definitely came out. We did a little film session just with the young people talking about their experiences and how proud they were of both their caring role and being part of an armed forces family. So that's kind of like a small project work that we've done with a group of young people. In our participation work overall, so we have our kind of like our big kind of project group. We have young people from forces families with a caring role who work on various different projects with us. And that really supports us to weave that into any work that we do. So our rights report that was published last year, our young people with caring roles talked about their experiences. We shared that to make sure that we are definitely thinking about young carers and forces families, about their rights. So that comes through in all our policy work. Other pieces of work that we've done is around working really closely with the Young Carers Service Alliance Network. So we've co-delivered with Carers Trust Scotland some CPD sessions to make sure that young carers services understand about Forces Life, and quite a few of those kind of services in key areas have made changes to the referral form. So there's a tick box there to say I'm in an armed forces family, so that those workers can have a conversation about service life and what the impact that has on their caring role, so that they understand, oh yes, it's a deployment coming up actually, and we'll have that conversation to see, is there additional support needed for that young person during that time? Or indeed, if they're moving on, to actually thinking about being in touch with another young carer service in that area. We've also done a lot of work with our colleagues in Army Welfare Service around them. I mean, a lot of them in the service already understand about caring roles, but for some workers, that's not something they've come across. So we've done some training sessions alongside them as well, and have had lots of conversations and some work around their staff handbook as well. So about welfare staff identifying young carers. So yeah, that's kind of the key things I can think of that we've kind of done to make a difference there.
Great, thanks, Nina. I'm conscious I've done a fairly poor job of chair in terms of timekeeping. Excellent answers. Didn't want to cut you any short, but Jude, I'm wondering if what we might do is share the briefing that we pulled together for MSPs in the chat for people to read, so they can see what our calls to action were. I wonder if you just want to briefly summarise what Marie Todd, who is the minister who has responsibility for young carers, sort of gave a commitment to in Parliament last week, and then I think we'll open it up for questions from the group to give you enough time. And apologies, I was too busy listening to these amazing answers to keep track of time, so apologies for being a poor chair today. You're on mute, Jude.
Yeah, no, it was just wonderful that some young carers were able to go to the Parliament last week, and it was just so, I was watching online, and it was just wonderful to see the amount of young people in the gallery, and just the commitment from some members of Parliament there. So the Scottish Government made several promises, I suppose, from the debate. So one of the promises they made was at Forces Children Scotland, we welcome their proposed legislation to establish a right to breaks for carers in what is now the Care Reform Scotland Bill. And we echo Marie Todd's statement in the debate that young carers should have that right rather than the government funding their breaks. So in law, they should have the right to receive breaks. So that is going ahead, hopefully. The Care Reform Bill's in its third stage before it becomes an act. So hopefully that will happen. And we also welcome the fact that ahead of the legislation, the Scottish Government will increase the voluntary sector short breaks funding in 2025 to 26 by a further 5 million, and making it to a total of 13 million. And that is expected to support up to 15,000 additional people, including Armed Forces young carers, in taking short breaks away from their caring responsibilities. And one of our calls to action was that the Scottish Government should ensure Forces young carers are assessed for a young carer statement, and support is easily transferred between local authorities, and that the Scottish Government must work with local authorities to uphold the duties under the Armed Forces Covenant and improve support for Forces young carers. But I just want to briefly make everyone in the webinar aware that although the Armed Forces Covenant wasn't mentioned specifically, in relation to Armed Forces young carers, we welcome the launch of the Carers Trusts Young Carers Covenant, which is a UK-wide commitment to young carers and young adult carers. And in this covenant, the Young Carers Covenant, it sets out 10 key outcomes that young carers from across the UK have said are key to improving their lives. And any organisation or individual in a position to take action to help achieve these outcomes is urged to sign up to the covenant. So if you haven't, we've signed up to it, so it's a fantastic covenant. So if you can, it'd be wonderful if you could sign up to the Young Carers Covenant. And we are, from the debate, we are delighted to learn the Scottish Government has formally committed to the covenant and the 10 outcomes that are contained within it. So that's great news. We also welcome the continued funding for the annual Scottish Young Carers Festival, and I know there's a national one as well. And Forces Children's Scotland have often provided an information stand for young carers from Forces families at this event. And some of the young carers we've worked with have attended with their own local young carers groups. So this will continue to help raise awareness for Forces young carers, as approximately 500 carers attend each year. So that was some of the positives from the debate, but it was just a wonderful debate to watch, and lots of fantastic contributions from the MSPs. So it was really informative. And what I will do in the chat is I can actually pop a transcript of the debate into the chat if you want to know more about the outcomes of the debate and what was said by different members of Parliament. So I'll just pop that into the chat just now, and you can have a look at that.
I tried to pop our briefing in the chat, but it failed to send for some reason. So if we can't send it in the chat, we'll send it out in an email afterwards. Thanks everyone so much. I wonder if we can just open it up now to questions. If people want to pop their videos back on, you can shout out, put a real hand up, an electronic hand up, pop it in the chat. But do people have questions or comments that they'd like to add to this, what has been a really interesting and helpful debate? Lou, I could have put money on the fact that you had your hand up first.
That. And I thought I'll get past that, but this has been such a really I am so pleased I came to this. This has been really helpful. I've learned a massive amount, so thank you all very much. I really appreciate it. I think one of the things I wrote a few things down while I was looking through, and I think at times we have a significant amount of hidden carers around the emotional support. So sometimes we can think about all of the physical sides, and as you've all said about the doing and the tasks, and I think at times that emotional support, especially during those intermittent times when maybe it's the stay-at-home parent that isn't coping, and that actually that young person steps up into being a young carer emotionally for those intermittent times. And I think sometimes that's quite hidden because it's the stay-at-home parent. And it was just something I thought, because that's something that really concerns me, because at times it just seeps out during various conversations that you might be having with people or families or whatever. And I just thought I would mention that because it's something that does concern me, and I'm not quite sure how you get, be able to explore that in more detail. And I think that's quite temporary, isn't it? It's, it's intermittent, it's temporary, it's when they're deploying or maybe separating. The other thing I wanted to mention, which I find really frustrating, and I don't know why it's happened, but I love it because I know there's people on this call that make differences, is that the child's plan that we have in Highland, and I presume that's Scotland-wide, is it? In my ignorance, I probably should know that. There used to be a question on there that asked, are you from is the family for Armed Forces family? That question was removed from the child's plan. It used to be there. And I just think actually that's a really important question to have on around supporting identification that they might be from an armed forces family, because if they don't identify, we can't, we know that bit. But anyway, I thought I would mention that because I know there are people on this call that have influence, and I thought I will just mention it because I think that's key to get that question back on. One of the things as well, I just wanted to say, I could go on forever, so I'll make this one my last one, I promise. 51 Brigade, the engagement team, quite often they will send me out things to say, could you send this out to schools? Could you get this across Highland? It's, team building, resilience, etc., that young people can go on. Generally, it's secondary age or from about P6, maybe upwards. And I just wondered whether that's something that Linda or Nicole tapped into with that 51 Brigade, the engagement team, because it might be that they might be able to promote it towards young carers as well, because I just send it out carte blanche to schools in the hope that it is picked up by whoever may benefit from that. But it might just be something to think about approaching them to maybe get something specifically that you can push that, because it's all paid for and it's free. Anyway, I'll be quiet because I have a list of things as usual, but I'll be quiet now. But thank you all. It's been fab.
Thanks, Lou. And in terms of the child plan, so the child plan is a Scotland-wide thing, but each local authority will have their own version of it. And I think that's one of the challenges. But I know when I spoke to Angela Hinnigan recently, the Scottish Government is certainly looking to try and understand more and put more markers in places to identify armed forces children. So I think we do need to work on that, Lou. It's really important. One of the other things we're currently trialling in a couple of settings is Jude has done a huge amount of work to develop a child impact assessment specifically around deployment, so pre, during and post deployments and separations. And one of the questions in there is very clearly around young carers and whether or not the responsibility increases at different points in that, so that can be identified. Jude, I'll let you explain a little bit more. I'm assuming that's why you've popped your hand up. You are on mute before you start talking, though.
Yeah, no, just going back to the point Lou was making about identification, and just going just with all the rights work we've been doing, I think on these forms, it's the parents, it's the families that tick it. And I think it's really important to stress the importance of the child and the young person and all the wonderful work that's happening. And it's just about trying to put the power back into their hands. And maybe that's in the future. It'd be wonderful to just have something that we could go to every single armed forces child, regardless of them being at a base, if they're away from base, where there was something that they were given just to identify it. I wish I had a magic wand.
Actually.
Yeah.
We send out in Highland, we send out the lifestyle survey, of which I have managed to get the question in now about, are you from an armed forces family? So that data will then link with if they also tick the box if they're a young carer. And interestingly, we have more numbers identifying from children than when the families identified enrolment for those cohorts that come in.
And I
think that's
the other,
isn't it? Yeah. I want to see FAMCAS for young people, like a Y CAS, C and Y CAS or whatever. Yes,
because all FAMCAS come, like when it comes to me, my son and daughter don't get a C in it at all, and it's all from my perspective. So yes, it's one. But again, there's the other side to the coin that a young person might not even know, as we've discussed, that they are a young carer. So it's a tricky situation. But yeah, power to the children and young people. Yeah, which is great to hear that's going on in Highlands. So yeah.
Does anyone else have any questions, thoughts?
If no one else is going to say something, I'm just going to throw something else out there, because Linda was saying, if you know of anybody, and please let us know, because this would be something that would be really helpful to us. And I'm just wondering, because I have inquiries obviously that come in, and I did have an inquiry in from a, you know, have lots of inquiries, but I did have somebody who is a veteran parent who said, I've just come across your website by chance, had no idea this was out there, the support, blah, 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 blah. And he then talked to me about being a veteran, that he had PTSD, that his offspring, let's say, were in secondary school, and he worried all the time about attainment, attendance when they did go to school, worried about because they were constantly on their phone checking if he was okay and texting to make sure he's responded. Okay, that's okay. I know he's alive. I know he's, you know, alive and kicking, and he didn't sleep at night. So the young carer didn't sleep because he had nightmares, etc., etc., etc. So that we sorted, you know, and connected with the school. So, but I'm wondering how to get round that when you're saying, because I have these inquiries that come in and you get the people to the right places, and we do that. But it's when it's about, is there something that you could give us that we could put out to schools to say, if you have young carers who are from armed forces families, that are from veterans, is there something, is that one way of approaching those families? And therefore it's a choice thing. It's a choice of whether, you know, that the school can put it out to, because they will know if they will be a young carer from a veteran family. And therefore it's a choice if the child, picks up the leaflet or scans the QR code and does that. But it's something that I would be prepared to do, to put out to Highland schools, but as long as it was the choice of the young person to go onto the QR code. So anyway, I thought I'd throw it out there, because if we can help in Highland, we will.
I'll let Lynn come in, but unfortunately Nexus is at the moment England based, and we have some barriers to delivering it in Scotland.
Oh, I didn't know that. I'm so sorry. I obviously had gone to boil the kettle at that point.
That's okay. We are exploring how we can do some work together to ensure that Scottish young people are supported, Lou, because I think it's a really good point that actually we've got a really amazing project in Englandshire that is doing amazing work, and how do we make sure that it replicates across here? How do we put a kilt on it, basically? So having a look at that. Lynn, do you want to come in and add anything to that?
I can just reiterate what Meg said. I mean, so the way we have leaflets that I can send up to you with the QR code on, but as Meg said, we've got this slight hurdle around the fact that we can't hold data for children and young people in Scotland. So we are in kind of conversation with Meg and the team about whether or not there's anything that we can do to override that. So I would probably say that let me chat to the team about it and decide whether or not that's feasible or not. But if anyone on the call is in England, then we can send you over, just pop your details in the chat, or find, if you search Nexus on Google, then in Young Carers and Armed Forces, then we come up, so you can get the information off there as well. But yeah, we are very keen on just promoting it so that children and young people have their own choice, and they can self-refer if they're over 16. If they're under 16, then they can just ask a parent or carer to complete the referral for them. So it's quite a simple process.
Well, thank you, but I'll wait then until it comes. But actually, I've just realised that Susan Reid, Army Welfare Service, is also on this call, and yes. I know Susan has connected with you, so I will probably otherwise I'll just muddy the waters, so I'll be quiet now.
That's fine, and there is the strong possibility that we could do it through the Army Welfare Service as well. So there's definitely routes that we could use to make it work if we do get referrals in from Scotland, because we're very keen to have those conversations, because I think it's an important part of the project that we do so. So if we can make it work, we definitely will.
We absolutely will. So thank you. And Susan, I love that wee heart that you put up there. Alison, you've got something to come in with?
Yeah, no, it was just to say, Lynn, I'm going on your call on Wednesday, I think, isn't it? We've got the networking. So Naval Children's Charity are a UK-wide charity. We are based in Portsmouth, where our head office is, and I'm the worker for the whole of Scotland. Just me, myself, and I up here covering this small wee village of Scotland that we have. But I'm also the young carer lead for the whole of NCC. So my background, and I know Nina from previous life, I managed the Young Carers Project for 5 years in Western Bartonshire, and I worked really closely with Helensburn Lomond. So it was just to say we work with veteran serving and ex-serving families and families transitioning out. So if there is anything obviously that's needed from a sort of naval perspective, then obviously you can let us know. I was just at a homecoming today with one of the submarines that just returned back from sea after breaking the biggest record of the longest deployment. So that was quite nice to see some of the families down there, and I see Gillian Gray quite often at a lot of things from Forces Children Scotland as well. So yeah, it was just to say, but yeah, Ellen, if there's any sort of leaflets or anything, because obviously, you know, like I say, for all I'm up in Scotland, but we are predominantly, you know, we've got our head office down in Portsmouth where the team are. So
Excellent.
also
Thanks.
very good, ladies. Thank you.
Thanks, Alison. That's really helpful. So yeah, and Kerry, thanks for the link in the chat. So I'm conscious we've got 1 minute left of our time. I'm going to pop in the chat a QR code, which if you scan will take you to a evaluation sheet for us. Jude's also going to pop in a Google link, so you can go in either of those ways. We'd really appreciate your feedback, particularly as I said at the start, this is a new way of doing a little bit of community learning development. I think it's been a really helpful way for me, certainly, to do it in conversation, but would really value your feedback in relation to that. But I will leave the floor. Is there any more questions from anyone while you have the expertise of Jude, Lynn, Nicole and Nina in the room? And we've got Alison with a lot of expertise as well. No, we're content. That tells us we've done quite well. Lou, the only other thing I would come in and say is, and I said I would come back to it and we've run out of time, I'm certainly doing a little bit of work at the moment with the Children's Commissioner for Scotland around the mobile phone blanket ban. I see that it's reared its head again in England with a Conservative MP trying to get it into the children's bill there. So we are absolutely trying to do some work from a children's rights perspective. For Forces children in general, we know when parents are deployed, particularly if they're deployed to another time zone, that might be school time, might be the only time that a young person can speak to their deployed parent. But from a young carer's perspective, it adds an extra dimension there. And as you said so eloquently, Lou, that's constantly checking phone to know if dad or mum or whoever they're caring from is okay. So we are certainly doing a little bit of policy work just now around that mobile phone ban. And as we know, blanket bans in general don't work because none of us are uniform and a homogenous group. So yeah, I will come back to you and let you know how we get on with that, Lou, but it's certainly a piece of work that we're trying to take forward.
I'm so pleased that I realised that Linda is obviously called Lou, because every time you said Lou, I thought you meant me.
No, Lynn, I'm saying Lynn, that's the Australian accent,
said Lou. Because at one point my head was down and then you kept saying it and I thought, whoa.
No, it was the point you made, Lou, around mobile phones. I was definitely coming in. I was talking to you. So yeah, great.
Thanks.
Well, thank you so much, everyone, for joining us. My apologies again for not sharing this quite as well as I could for time-wise, but I think we covered everything we wanted to cover. And if you think these have been helpful or you'd like this to be revisited with some more time, let us know and we will take this forward again. So thank you very much for joining us. Really enjoyed having you here and we will see you again next time, hopefully. Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.
Excellent.
Just us chickens left.
Well done.
Oh, I think that was really